Hi, everyone. I'm Joffre, Swait, academic advisor and humanities teacher at Kepler Education. And I am here today with Ryan Griffiths, also an integrated humanities teacher at Kepler. Ryan, welcome.
Hello. How's it going today?
I'm doing great. I'm actually looking forward to this. We're going to do a short series on the value of integrated humanities. And the theme for our conversation today is about the truth, beauty, and goodness that comes from integrating the humanities. What's behind that beyond maybe some sort of modernistic search for efficiency, right? That's not why we slam three subjects into one. Actually, maybe we should start the video. Maybe you could explain what an integrated humanities course is.
Yeah, sure. So an integrated humanities course, as you alluded to, is combining different subjects of the humanities, whether it be English, literature, history, theology, philosophy, which are all often taught and taught well separately in individual classes of their own. But in an integrated humanities course, when you bring those all together, it really brings those individual subjects to life in a way that they cannot that they can't always necessarily attain by themselves. Philosophy brings a perspective to English literature that it wouldn't have otherwise. Theology brings a perspective to history that it wouldn't have otherwise. So an integrated humanities course, to me, is really getting each of those humanities courses at their best, showing them off in the best light or the best perspective.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about, so literature is best taught with a bit of philosophy, or philosophy best taught with a bit of literature. And that's actually something all good teachers recognize, because all good teachers actually do integrate when they're teaching their subject, right? For a lot of subjects, that's what people call, they think of it as relatability or connecting, right? You want to find some way your student will come to the subject differently and really be able to grab onto it. That's just integrating, right? And so our courses, these integrated humanities courses, do that very purposefully. So we both are offering Old Western culture courses, which are these big, great books, readers courses, and then we have these Socratic discussions with the Kepler students about these great books that they're reading. Today, we actually want to compare and contrast, right? Integrated classical methods of teaching versus, I suppose, standard pedagogies of the day. Now, you've taught at the university level, at the high school level. Maybe you could compare some of your experience, out there in the world, and how these two different pedagogies are different.
Yeah. So thinking back to the classes that I've taught at a university level, they were mostly composition courses, English composition courses. And of course, the type of class that you're teaching restricts you to some extent, the types of conversations you can have in class, and also to the sort of assignments and projects you can do with the students. So take, for example, a course that isn't an integrated humanities course, but is just a regular humanities course, as you mentioned, running off the pedagogies of the day. An English class or literature class, you could expect to be assigned a literary analysis essay, essays breaking down a poem, things like that. And those are all good. But with an integrated humanities course, as a teacher, it's much more, one, fun for me, but also fun for the students, for them to be able to dip their toes into these multiple genres of essays. So they're not just getting a literary analysis essay or breaking down a poem. They're also getting, in the same class, argumentative essays, research based essays, bringing in essays that are you typically find in a history course or a philosophy course or in a rhetoric course. So it's not 4 assignments doing the same thing or 5 assignments doing the same thing. Each assignment is a different genre of writing. So the students come out of that course more well versed in the different styles of writing, the different types of writing that they're going to need for their future academic careers. And
Right.
as the teacher, it also makes it more fun to grade too. So you're not grading
Yeah.
literary analysis all throughout the year. You're grading something different each time. So I think both students and teachers benefit from that.
Yeah, so you're, part of the appeal then is just the variety of work and the variety of assignments, the variety of reading. You know, one of the things that really strikes me about, so you have the formal aspects of integrating subjects, right? And so you have a plethora of different types of readings, great, and the students are doing this and that. But with classical pedagogy and teaching these classics classically, Socratic dialogue,
Mm.
conversation, these questions that draw out the student. Uh, when you are integrating, you're dealing with whole humans and the whole of reality, and that makes it that much easier for the student to interact with the material. Right, the student sees that it's legitimate, that she comes at the question, at the subject from a different angle than the standard the teacher is setting, right? And the more they drink those waters, the more confident they become in that. But they even see it from the teacher, right? Because it's as the academic advisor, it's actually sort of fun to see how the different integrated humanities teachers. So you and I are the main ones at the high school level, and then Mrs. Leary for junior high. But we've got Dr. Postma and Wes Callahan, and so all these integrated humanities teachers, and they all integrate differently, right? So you have the formal aspects of it, but then you also have the informal things where it's like, hey, Mr. Griffiths is going to be a little more literary in how he approaches everything, right? Even the philosophy, and like the stories he tells are more likely to be literary. I come at things with a linguistic approach very often. And it could even become a joke with the students. Like Mr. Swait's always going to find some word or some etymological thing. And so each of the teachers brings themselves to that integration, which is, when I mentioned earlier that like good teachers always integrate anyway. That's what they're integrating, right? They're integrating their life and their experience, trying to find these hooks for the students. But you could actually like make that your pedagogy. It fits with a discipleship mentoring model of what Socratic conversation and classical education is, I think.
Yeah, and maybe that's one of the reasons why, at least in my mind, an integrated humanities course, when you're teaching in this integrated manner, it's more of a personal approach because it avoids becoming formulaic. Because, like you said, each teacher shapes it, and it shapes the teacher. There's a mutual reshaping when they come to teach that subject because they're coming from different disciplines, different backgrounds. So
Yeah.
it's much more of a personal experience teaching the class, and I think, like you mentioned, with Socratic dialogues, it's much more of a personal conversation for the students when they approach the classical texts this way, because it's not asking them to pick up Julius Caesar or whoever and asking them to read them in the context of this is a credit that you need for a history course. Through the dialogues with the other students, with the teachers, ideally they come to him as a fellow human, somebody
Yeah.
who's a part of their inheritance that they can learn from or learn either to imitate or not to imitate him. So yeah, it's much more personal in teaching in the integrated manner, I think.
I think Julius Caesar is a really interesting example because you could study the Gallic Wars and say an antiquities course in college or perhaps high school. You could study the Gallic Wars in a Latin class. You might study the Gallic Wars in a military history course at the college level, which I did. I was a military history geek. But you know, when you're studying something like the Gallic Wars in this integrated fashion, then it elevates the conversation in this sense. If you're reading him in a Latin course, you are evaluating the Latin syntactically and in a very detailed fashion. And you could say, well, he's sort of prosaic. He's a military man. He writes like an engineer. Okay. Or if you're reading it as a military history, you might comment on the literary qualities, but it's just going to be a comment. You're focused on it as a military history, and this focus actually tends to narrow. And when you're studying in this integrated fashion, and you've just read Sallust, and you're going to be reading, Bede in a few months, you're comparing it to other historians, or you just finished reading a work of philosophy or some poetry that was the language is amazing, and then you're okay. Well, this is really illuminating about who Julius Caesar was. Right? He was no poet. He organized armies and crossed rivers and built fleets, and you see that because of the comparison, because of the integration, it actually elevates that. I could say everything I just said in any course teaching the Gallic Wars, but there's so much more of a conversation and an understanding of that, because the study of the Gallic Wars is happening in a way where it's interacting with all these different sorts of works.
Yeah, and it also informs other disciplines like literature, and like you mentioned, philosophy. Sure, Julius Caesar doesn't seem to have been poetic, but he inspires poets, right?
Yeah,
So
you
can reading Lucan, reading other poets all the way up into the present day. Shakespeare writing the play Julius Caesar, they see something in this historical figure that's profoundly literary. There's a story to tell there about his character, about his flaws, that you wouldn't get from studying about the Gallic Wars from a military historian context, or from a language context. So yeah, and that kind of goes back to what I said earlier about how it elevates each of the individual subjects and shows them off in the best light possible. Because you can study Julius Caesar as a military historian and think that you know all that there is to know about Julius Caesar, and then there's this whole other branch of subject matter that you can take from his works that you haven't touched yet.
Right. Well, I'd love to talk about how this classical integrating way of teaching and of learning exists today, in contrast to standard pedagogies and critical pedagogies. Because really, like the dominant way, I when I was in college in the 90s, you could see it kind of on the edges in academia. But now it's just, standard. Any government elementary school, it's just like everything is critical theory. I actually see these as not just different, and we can go different, and one is good and one is bad, but actually as directly opposed. We're talking about two things that actually are the opposites of each other.
Yeah. A minute ago when I mentioned coming to somebody like Julius Caesar as a friend, one of the things that I see critical theory doing, I know that the critic Harold Bloom, I think it's Harold Bloom, calls different critical theories the theories of resentment. But really, I would also point out that they're theories of suspicion. Students are taught to approach classical works, older works, with a suspicion of the author's motives and a suspicion of what they're really saying. And mastery of that text is considered to be the ability to dissect it right?
Hmm.
To pick apart Shakespeare and say, oh, okay, what was he really saying when he wrote this?
Yeah.
What are the
What power was he trying to grab? Right. Because everything's a
yes,
power narrative.
or what power was he speaking for, right? Because critical
Right.
theory likes to break everything
Yes.
down into power dynamics. So the individual is just a mouthpiece for the uh, power that happens to be in charge or dominant at the time. And so, of course, yeah. And on that note, there's going to be biases to discover in Shakespeare or Homer or what have you. And so, critical theory is really interested in that sort of approach from the point of view of suspicion, and it's interested in this sort of dissection, which, of course,
Mm.
dissection is the opposite of integration, right? So
Right.
I think
Precisely.
you're very right to say that these two are opposed theories and methods of teaching.
And and some parents watching this may recall, of course, everyone is fully aware of wokeness, right, and how it's crashing into our society and doing what it's designed to do, which is breaking things apart. But parents will probably recall deconstruction,
Mm.
right, and just the postmodern theories of just text and literature. Well, that was part of critical theory, right? So in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and you're reading people like Foucault say, or they're influencing education and the way texts are approached. It even got into like biblical like textual criticism, and people would talk about textual criticism, and it wasn't touching yet in the public eye any of this woke stuff. But it was all part and parcel. It all was a part of critical theory. Critical theory is old, and ultimately we could trace it back to the Enlightenment. But critical theory itself, as a thing, was around for most of the 20th century, and
Well,
now we're drinking it in and poisoning ourselves.
it is very interesting to watch wokeness, if we want to term it that. It's interesting to watch it play itself out in culture, because you're right, it does have its origins in academia. And I encountered it first in academia. And then, just when you think you've escaped and you get out into the world, there it is again.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
blossomed into this monstrous thing. Uh,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, you're fine.
Well, I was going to say, I thought you said something really key a little earlier, which is that I don't know if you use the term deconstruction or what exactly, but this is why these are the opposites, right? We have integration, bringing things together, versus, and we don't have to go into the anarchy that might be in our society and in our educating right now. Just, we could keep it in a cozy little study. Deconstruction, pulling things apart, dissecting, that is the opposite of integration.
Mm.
And that eventually, like kicking a football at goalposts, right, the slightest angle change, the longer it goes, the wider that variance, the bigger that miss is going to be. And so this the integration goes in a certain direction, the disintegration goes in another, and so things fall apart with one way of teaching, and teaching. Education is the raising of humans, right?
Mm.
Primarily the parents responsibility, but that's what education should be, and that includes the learning of algebra or whatever. And so integration is going to bring everything together in a whole, and it works with creation. As God has made the world, the great three in one has made the world. Things come together. So I think that's a really important. I said there were opposites, but to actually say that specifically, right? Deconstruction deconstructs.
Mm.
Integration integrates. It makes it whole. It brings it together.
And it brings life, we might say, because
Mm.
what happens when you break something apart? You destroy it. And Gandalf says in The Lord of the Rings, he who breaks the thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because let's say you take a classical text. I'm picking on Shakespeare today, so we'll just use Shakespeare as an example. Let's say you take a Shakespeare play and deconstruct it. you break it into pieces, and now you have this pile of dead letters. And what are you going to make out of it? Well, what you're going to be tempted to do is reconstruct it in your own image.
Well, that's the whole purpose. That's what people are taught, right?
Mhm.
Break this apart so you can. It's not you're not finding a true meaning or a hidden meaning. There is no meaning. All narratives are power grabs. Break this thing apart and remake it in your own power grab.
Yes.
Make the world the way you want it to be.
And then you're not reading Hamlet anymore. You're not reading Shakespeare's Hamlet anymore. You're reading your Hamlet.
Yes.
And the classic joke about that is that, you know, the third wave reads the New Testament and comes away with the conclusion, oh, wow, I didn't know this, but Jesus Christ was really a third wave feminist the whole time.
Yeah.
and that's
Yes.
you know, that's the
Yes.
the approach. You're not really engaging the text. You're not really engaging the author when you're approaching them that way. You're just tossing your own ideas out into the void and then retrieving them for yourselves and taking them as something foreign and new, when it's really just you.
Yes.
The emphasis is on your thoughts.
Well, and really direction is what it's all about, because classically educated people are actually really exceptional, and people notice it at bringing in illustrations, right? Like something happens in life and you have a quote handy, or you can say, well, that's like when, but that's not the same thing as just being, rebuilding a work of art, say in your own image. Only in this world could we have like a literary criticism idea, like death of the author as a serious thing. The idea of death of the author isn't that the author is actually dead. It's that you can interact with a piece of work by killing the author in your own mind, right, and make it something of your own. And that's just as an exercise, it's a relatively neutral thing. But as a philosophy, as soon as you start walking with it, it's destructive.
Well, the death of the author is an idea that follows the idea of the death of God, right?
Yes, precisely.
So Nietzsche says God is dead in the 19th century, and following that, we have there's the death of the author, or the author doesn't matter either. So if you're going to live life according to this modernist nihilistic outlook, you might as well interpret classical literature or any literature in that way too, right?
Yes.
So it is consistent, I guess, with that outlook, but it's certainly not a life bringing or an elevating outlook. And like you said earlier, part of our jobs as humanities teachers is to raise the students and ourselves through teaching, through interactions with these works.
Yes.
It's to make us better, not to make us drift and wayward and ultimately conclude that we're fine as we are being drifting and wayward.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's, if you have an atomizing outlook on life, then you are going to live an atomized, fragmented life. There's we're talking about pulling things apart, and there's this poem by Billy Collins that I've actually read this at least once on a Kepler or some other Kepler thing, the Kepler Consortium podcast. I know I've read this in talking about classical education, but this is the thing. We're talking very purposely right now about integrated humanities and about integrating. But it goes beyond integrated humanities. Everything should be integrated in the classical outlook. But so whenever you're talking classical education, you end up talking about integrating, and it stands in this clear contrast to the way people are taught to think these days. And this poem is a fantastic illustration. Billy Collins was poet laureate of the United States about 20 years ago, a literature professor as well. And so Introduction to Poetry is the name of the poem. And it's about, I imagine, a freshman class, but it's about a class learning, some introduction to poetry class, and how the students approach the poems compared to how the teacher wants them to interact with it. So I'll read you and the audience this poem. Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a colored slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. I know there's no literal ripping things apart in here, but that's they kill the poem, right? It's like,
Yes.
We have to beat at this thing instead of asking it what it means, right? Instead of exploring the poem, instead of walking inside the poem, instead of waving at the poem as you go past, like looking at it, they want to break it apart, to destroy it, to figure out what it really means. That's the idea behind deconstruction. But that
Yes.
what it really means is, well, it ends up being up to each reader or each group, each ideological group.
Well, that's going back to that idea of the criticism of suspicion again. You don't want to walk through the poem. You want to torture a confession out of it. And this might be a bit of a jump here, but I'm kind of reminded of a place in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul says that the unsaved can't understand some these concepts because they're spiritual matters, and to the unspiritual, they're spiritually discerned. I'm not remembering the exact chapter and verse of that, but we could compare that to studying other works aside from Scripture too. If you're not willing to immerse yourself into it, if you're not willing to walk through that world, but you want to go into it with a shield up and with a microscope and binoculars or whatever will enable you to see distorted versions of different parts of it, you're not going to experience what the author intended and what you could fully intend doing it. You're not using the proper discernment if that's your method of teaching literature.
Right. Well, I think there's a profound irony there with and Christians have run into this irony in every sphere of life, where we're the ones who are told that we're closed-minded. And as we're both Christian teachers, and I'm an academic advisor, and I answer questions about Kepler all the time and about being a Christian teacher and how our courses are taught by other Christian teachers. And Kepler, we take a mere Christian approach. Any sort of Christian can teach for us, as long as they're Christian, who proclaim the lordship of Jesus Christ. So we have Greek Orthodox, we have Anglican, we have Lutheran, we have Baptist, we have Presbyterian, right? Your standard evangelical, like whatever, right? Like, but they're all teaching as Christians, and of course they bring themselves into it, but they don't have this hermeneutic of suspicion that you mentioned. And so I have often answered questions that have to do with, that you could tell that the person is imagining a Christian education as being something closed, when the way we teach actually lets the piece say what it has to say, right? And then we respond to it, right? If Socrates has something to say, then we're going to hear it and we're going to interact with that. Is that Christian? And we're going to have our opinions, we're going to have our takes, but we're going to let Socrates speak for himself, right? And so I just really, it's amusing yet tragic that there's this, people have this perception that we're going to be the closed-minded ones, when in fact we're the ones who have the confidence to let the ancients have their say, right? And let the unfashionable ones have their say, and then we interact.
Yeah. Do you think that's because it would make sense to me that we are more able to interact openly and freely with some of these other authors because we have a firm foundation of our own. On Christ, this solid rock I stand, right? So
Yeah,
having that firm foundation enables us to have a place from which to grasp and grapple with these ideas. I'm bringing in a wrestling metaphor, I guess. But
absolutely.
without that, um, the ideas are going to overwhelm you either way, and you're going to be tossed about from one to the other.
Yeah,
And so that's why I think these the hermeneutics of suspicion, like you mentioned, critical theory, I think those are brought in lieu of a Christian approach, because there's sort of a subconscious recognition that you have to have some sort of foundation. And if your foundation isn't God, what is it? Well, critical
yes,
theory is going to say we're above the power dynamics and all the biases and structures that have always existed in the world. So we can look at it from a bird's eye, objective standpoint.
yeah,
When really that bird's eye objective standpoint is in the midst of it,
yeah, yeah.
not above it.
And I would say that critical theory is a direct rebellion against the one true God because it arose in a post-Christian world. But
Mm,
quite frankly, any culture with some idea of an objective truth. I mean, Christ has the primacy, Christ is the solid rock, but any concept of objective truth would be an advantage over
yes.
the mental destruction that critical theory causes, right?
So like even the Enlightenment has a leg up in that regard, because
Yes, yeah,
it believed in something,
right. It
right?
was pointed the wrong
Postmodernism doesn't
way, but
believe in anything.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so just reminding everybody, like we're talking about this because we are contrasting, an integrating classical approach versus that disintegrating critical and woke approach. You should definitely check out Mr. Griffiths and Mr. Swait's integrated humanities courses at Kepler as a solution to this great plague in modern education. Hmm.
Yes, sometimes uh, I think I would say that I experienced this to some extent, in when I was in college. But sometimes you would find yourself as a student having to reapproach certain authors that you'd read on your own so that you could actually appreciate them. You would be introduced to them in the class only to see that they're suspect for some reason or another, and then you return to them on your own and you go, oh well, they weren't thinking of that at all. Whatever they were suspected of thinking. So uh, in lieu of that, why not just avoid the trouble and be introduced to them on their own proper footing in the classroom? Right? And that's what I think you and I are doing.
Yes.
We're facilitating these meetings, as it were, between the students and the authors. Not to make it sound occultish or seancey, but we're communicating with the past in this way,
Right.
and experiencing firsthand uh, these authors instead of a gloss or something like that.
Yeah. By the way, just like an aside, we're not saying that there is one standard way of reading each great work and this is what it means. No, it is all a conversation. The important
Mhm.
thing is that we are asking the text what it means, what it's saying, right? We're not coming to it already with the idea of we're going to tell it what it means. I'm going to bring my experience and that's going to dictate. No, my experience will affect my eyes and ears as I interact with this thing, but I'm asking it what it means. That's the fundamental, enormous difference, right? And so
Yes.
people are taught everywhere, like visual arts. You look at a canvas and you're supposed to tell it what it means, and you ask the visual artist, and the visual artist is insulted to be asked what it means, because that's not how it's done. Actually, that is how it's done. The artist is making something that is meant to communicate and the viewer, the hearer, the reader is meant to try to understand that thing, and then let it grow from there, right? Then
Mhm.
you're into your experience and your own your lived experience, as the phrase goes, is then, then there's a back and forth and there's a conversation.
Yeah, and I think of all the various schools of criticism, new criticism uh, probably came closest to that, letting the text speak for itself. Um, uh, but I think where integrated humanities comes in, kind of picks up where new criticism ends. You let the text speak for itself, but you don't necessarily study it in a vacuum either, like a new critic might suggest, because it's embedded in the history and in the philosophy of that time period, right? So,
And
um,
I love, by the way, like, the new criticism is obviously like in the critical movement, like it's an attempt to adjust. It's already kind of later in the movement. I love how you sort of put it, like integrated humanities is an improvement upon that, as if, and I know you don't think that, but as if it had come later. Like the old things are still the best things, right? Like
yes.
we keep going back and having, okay, well, let's bring it on back. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I agree with what you said. That there's not one specific way to teach a particular text. It's more of an openness, right? Coming back to that idea of being able to be open-minded as Christians as we approach these works in ways that others either can't or don't, and that affords us a better study of whatever author it happens to be.
Yeah.
Because just as an example that pops into mind, and thinking about integrating these different areas of the humanities, you can read a work of philosophy like uh, John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, right? He's sort of refining Jeremy Bentham's philosophy of utilitarianism, and on the surface of that philosophy seems relatively harmless, the greatest happiness principle. People have tried, and I think Mill tries to an extent to integrate utilitarianism with Christian thought, Christian philosophy. But when you see it acted out, it looks very different in practice than it does on paper. And if you read a novel like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, you see a character thinking very specifically in a utilitarian sense, what's going to bring the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest amount of people. And he's using that philosophy to justify cold-blooded murder for basically his own material gain. But he's
Yes.
thinking like a utilitarian as he does it. He says, with the advantages that I can accrue from murdering this one worthless, not nice person, I'm going to help so many other people. So that's a perspective that you get when you're bringing in philosophy and literature, that you wouldn't necessarily get if you're just studying philosophy, right?
Right. The thing that makes me think of is actually how reality is integrated, right? So we've talked about how, integrating, we're bringing things together, but we can pretend, our society can pretend that we can, you know assign our own meanings to everything. But the thing is that the greatest happiness for the most people, that idea is now embedded in our culture, has been for a couple of centuries, and it keeps going and widening out. And that's, that it is a whole thing. It is a thing unto itself that had its own life. So because when you bring things together, you treat it as a whole, and then you can ask, well, what will it do, right?
Mm.
Where does it go? But we're blind to that as a culture, and we can't in fact see. And that's actually one of the, you bring in Dostoevsky, and like it's like we can see these, great artists, great authors, like, they're bringing that insight early on, right? And showing us, oh, this is where it's going to go. This is why we integrate.
Hmm. That's interesting. Almost almost prophetic in a way, you might say. Not that
Yeah.
I'm ascribe to, the artists being the new prophets or anything like that. But in a sense, we read history to find out what happened in the past, but to find out what happened in the future, well, one, we can also read history for that too, right? Because human nature
Yes.
doesn't change. But we can also read fiction for that as well, because if someone can imagine it, someone can do it. And Dostoevsky and a couple other authors, seem to eerily predict. I think C.S. Lewis predicts very well our current cultural and educational predicament in The Abolition of Man.
Yes.
And the what's the name of the third book of the Ransom trilogy? I just blanked on it. That
Okay.
hideous strength.
Yeah.
That hideous strength. I think that he captures very well what he didn't live to see completely acted out in his own lifetime.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm sort of getting the sense as this conversation starts to take off. We could go at this for 5 or 6 hours and just just talk to each other. But yeah, so this conversation has been themed around the idea of comparing, right, and integrating classical model with a disintegrating critical view. By the way, like you mentioned The Abolition of Man. See, this is why we would just keep talking forever. The Abolition of Man is a great book for any Christian to kind of understand where all classical teachers come from, right? The men with chests, and it's a very short book, and it's actually written kind of in response to a textbook, so it's all about education, but of course, being about education, it's about life. Anyway.
The textbook. Yeah, I know we won't stay on it forever, but you're right. It's written in response to a textbook that looks like it came from a more standard pedagogy, right? Definitely not an integrated one. So that textbook can kind of represent what we're not doing here at Kepler.
I'm telling you, it's all there. It's all in Plato,
there,
as Lewis would say. Well, so this is the first of 3 conversations we're going to have. So the second conversation is going to ask the question. Well, fill in the blank. Integrating is best because. Okay. And of course, we've already begun to dance with that topic. But then the third video the title is, provisionally at least, Humanities at their best. So we've started out with this big, wide view of society and culture and teaching and the transmission of culture and knowledge, and we're going to be narrowing it down until we're talking about just the humanities. Of course, as humanities teachers, but we're going to there's going to be a slight narrowing to the topics as we have these 3 conversations. I'm looking forward to this, and I think it's going to be a great way for families to get to know us.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it as well.
All right. Well, everyone who's been watching, thanks so much. Subscribe to the channel or wherever you're listening or watching. Keep on following, and feel free. Both our profiles are on the website Kepler.education. Feel very free to email either one of us. Ryan, I appreciate you, man.
Thank you.
So long.